Hello, this is Simon Brew, an editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs really that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast, well, they tend to have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, respecting just how difficult it is to make a film and appreciating the people who manage to do so. I think that's enough preamble, though. So without further ado, I'm just going to get on with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm digging back into the world of James Bond for this one. Let me take you back to 1987. I'll play you a clip first. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
The name that means excitement is back. Bond. James Bond.
That girl must be very talented.
Shoot up.
Believe me, my interest in her is purely professional.
What is this?
I've had a few optional extras installed.
Wherever he goes, adventure follows.
Two of our men are dead. Koskov's named you.
Then I must die.
Eliminate him.
Kill him!
That then was a clip from the 15th James Bond movie, The Living Daylights, dating back to 1987. Directed by John Glenn, based on Ian Fleming's short story, The Living Daylights, and a screenplay to this one by Richard Maybaum, Michael G. Wilson, the cast led by Timothy Dalton in his first appearance as James Bond, Mariam Darbo, Joe Don Baker, Art Malik, John Rhys Davies and Jerome Crabb. Now, this one follows, of course, 1985's A View to a Kill, and that would be the final James Bond adventure for Roger Moore in the role. And so I'm going to be drawing on two books in particular to tell this story. The first, I've recommended it lots of times, is the excellent Some Kind of Hero, the remarkable story of the James Bond films by A.J. Chowdhury and Matthew Field. And the second is the autobiography of Bond producer, the late Albert R. Broccoli, Cubby Broccoli. His autobiography is called When the Snow Melts. And it wasn't the biggest revelation to suggest that 1985's A View to a Kill was not one of the most popular James Bond films. It was a movie where Roger Moore had been persuaded to play Bond even though he was in his late 50s, and critics didn't waste much time drawing attention to his age in their reviews. But also, the Bond saga was one that Broccoli was very keen to keep going, that the plan was always, as always, for James Bond to return, even if the title wasn't necessarily teased, and Broccoli wanted another film, the 15th, for 1987, which would mark 25 years of 007 on the big screen. But going back to Cubby Broccoli's memoir, I mean, he opens chapter 20 and it's fairly candid, really. He says it was inevitable that we would have to make changes. Nothing lasts forever. Actors are no different from producers or Secret Service agents. We all grow older. And he says when A View to a Kill was released, the results pointed to a couple of uncomfortable truths. First, it just didn't do the kind of business we've been used to. Second, and not unconnected with the first, we urgently had to find a new James Bond. And so while Roger Moore wasn't said to be quitting as soon as A View to a Kill was released, Broccoli's head was certainly moving in the direction of a replacement, and he wasn't likely to wait around. In fact, it was in California where Broccoli delivered the news. That, again, going back to his memoir, he says Moore had made, and he went out of his way in here to talk about what a good friend Moore had been and how fond he was of him. But he said he'd made 7 Bond films, created strong audience support throughout the world. But as I said, nothing lasts forever. We both happened to be in California at the time. I rang and invited him over to the house, and he said, you realise, Roger, we're going to have to make a change. I think you probably understand that. You've had a great run, but I think we now have to call it a day. And he said, I want this to be a business-like arrangement. It'd be better if it looked like your decision rather than ours. If you want to say officially now that you're not going to make any more Bonds, I'll happily go along with that. Either way, I'd like it to happen quickly before we start on the next picture. And so he describes that Roger Moore found this as a shock, but then after quietly absorbing the news, and clearly he wasn't thrilled with it, it's described as he looked at me, smiled and put out his hand and said, I agree, Cubby, I think it's time. Roger Moore's tenure as 007 was all but officially ended in May 1986 when they held a testimonial dinner for him in his honour at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and it was described as a lavish occasion with stars and other celebrities from both the UK and Britain paying their tributes. And he said any movie actor in the world would be happy to settle for that career peak in his life. And then, as Broccoli said, now we had to get on with the show. And the show was going to be different. He said, Michael, as in Michael G. Wilson, and I decided we not only needed a new 007, but an entirely fresh concept for the 15th James Bond film. A tonal shift was incoming and would duly arrive when the final cut of the movie landed in 1987. But it wasn't necessarily always posited that way, because it was in the aftermath of the release of A View to a Kill that the usual writers were brought back, Richard Maybaum and Michael G. Wilson, and they actually began working on a screenplay for James Bond 15 towards the end of 1985. Now, I think it's pretty well known that there was an idea that came up that would be revisited when Daniel Craig took on the mantle of Bond, of doing a raw Bond, almost a prequel story, really, that a Bond who didn't have experience, that this would be a film based around his first mission and then potentially would even lead into the first James Bond film, Dr. No. But again, Albert R. Broccoli knew what he wanted, and that was not it. His argument was he felt audience didn't want to see a novice Bond. They wanted someone who knew what he was doing. These Bond films were escapism. They wanted to be entertained. They didn't want someone finding their way through. Now, this idea would be revisited in 2006 Casino Royale, hugely successfully as well. But even though they were looking ultimately for a tonal change with The Living Daylights, it wasn't going to be that much of a tonal change. Still, Maybaum and Wilson started working, even though it wasn't clear who'd be James Bond when they started work on the new film, because at the point they were writing, Moore was still the incumbent, but the conversations were ongoing about would he really come back for one more film. I mean, if he did press ahead with another 007 adventure, he would be touching 60 by the time it was released. And there was a 2-year cycle to think about here. The Bond films were coming fast and furious, and thus the writers, to a degree, had to hedge their bets. They had to put together a Bond film where they weren't entirely sure who'd be wearing the tuxedo in it. Now, it was decided in the end fairly quickly that the short story The Living Daylights was going to be the source of this. This was a mid-1960s Ian Fleming story that he'd penned. That wasn't enough to flesh out a full 2-hour feature, or in this case a 2-hour 10-minute feature, but there was stuff in there that could be the basis for the movie, and so the new film could start crowing up. So by the end of 1985, director John Glenn had agreed to come back for a 4th consecutive James Bond movie. He would be helming this one. That they could start doing some pre-production location scouting work in the early stages of 1986, even though the issue of James Bond at that point wasn't sorted out. But the basics were starting to come together, that they knew roughly where they were going to be shooting. They could start designing bits and bobs for the film. The one thing they had to resolve was who was going to be the leading actor. And so with the decision made that Roger Moore would no longer be 007, the question turned to who would. And I mean, the chronology of this is all over the place, but I'll just try and summarise who was in the running at this point. So Sam Neill, you know him more recently from Jurassic Park, Jurassic World films, and a huge array of independent movies. Well, he reportedly came close, and in the end it was Cubby Broccoli who decided against him, that Broccoli was leaning towards a British actor for the role, and that was one of the things that was said to have ended Mel Gibson's potential interest in playing James Bond. It also didn't help that Gibson was reportedly going to cost 8 figures for a 2-film commitment, and that simply wasn't the kind of money that the James Bond films were throwing around. These were not top-end blockbuster movies, at least when it came to the financial packages of the ensemble. Now, Timothy Dalton became an early frontrunner, and he told the Los Angeles Times that he'd been sounded out first of all as a possible James Bond in the 1970s as a replacement for Sean Connery. And in fact, the story goes that he was sounded out a couple of times at different points in time to play Bond, the earliest when he was 25 years old, and he just felt he was too young to play 007 at that stage, and so passed on the role. Now, this time round, when he was sounded out as a potential replacement for Roger Moore, he was committed to doing a couple of plays in the West End. And so, again, I mean, he just simply wasn't going to be available to play 007. And that left the path relatively clear for a pretty unknown actor at that stage by the name of, you know it's coming, Pierce Brosnan. And it's no secret that he bobbled to the top of this one, but also it's no secret there was a problem. That Brosnan had signed a 7-year deal to the NBC television network in the US for the television drama Remington Steele, and he was a core part of that. It was building him up some profile as well. But then an opportunity opened up when NBC pulled the plug on the show, and Brosnan thought he was free of his commitment to it. And so we get to about June of 1986, and Brosnan sat there thinking he's the new 007, that at this stage Albert R. Broccoli had signed off on his casting, that a 3-picture deal was being agreed, the contract not completely signed because they just needed to fully extricate him from his NBC commitments, but it looked like the search for the next James Bond was over. But as the profile of Brosnan rose and it became an open secret that he was in the running for James Bond, well, NBC's eyebrows were raised, and it had, of course, a change of heart, because what it had got built into his contract for the Remington Steele show was a 60-day clause, that NBC had 60 days to take up an option on him for future series of the show, and the clock was ticking. So while it was ticking, Brosnan was at the stage of doing costume fittings and promo shots, but also NBC was interested in bringing Remington Steele back and bringing Brosnan back to it. And so a negotiation was going on between Albert R. Broccoli and the representatives of NBC to see just how much time they would need. Could Brosnan do both? I mean, that was mooted at one point. And the disaster for Brosnan, at least at that point in time, came 3 days from the end of day 60 of that contract option. And that was when he learned that NBC had exercised the option in his contract for 20 more episodes. And there was no way around it that the making of 20 more episodes of Remington Steele was going to be the kind of time commitment that would completely knock Brosnan out of the running and being able to make the Bond movie. And so he had to walk away. And in fact, he wouldn't do 20 episodes by the end. But as People magazine then took up the mantle of the casting story, and it said the producers had talked to 60 aspirants in one recent week alone, with names like Finlay Light and Brian Brown in the mix. But with Brosnan dropping away, it was Dana Broccoli who suggested giving Timothy Dalton another try. Now, this time his schedule was a bit freer, that he had a commitment to a television movie by the name of Brenda Starr, but his West End commitments had been completed, and so they met up in London and he tested again for the role. And Dalton, as he tells the story himself in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, he was about to board a plane to start the shoot of Brenda Starr when he got the phone call and accepted the role after a minute of thinking to be the new James Bond. That a reported 3-picture deal was agreed for him to do so. The salary was said to have been around $500,000, and Dalton was finally announced in August 1986, not at the first time of trying, as the new 007. Now, while the press were trying to find out who he was, what he was up to, and all the things that the press tend to get into. The simple fact is Dalton wasn't there at the announcement. He was away in America filming at that point, so they couldn't do the kind of press launch that Daniel Craig, for instance, had to endure before he took on the tuxedo. But Dalton was still preparing for the role. He was getting into this. He knew the writing of Ian Fleming. He was delving into it. He was very much on board with the idea of taking the Bond films in a darker, harder direction, really. And I think what's clear is the work that was done across the two Dalton films would pave the way for the Daniel Craig era of Bond. Now, Wilson and Maybaum's script was pretty much in place at the point that Dalton signed on the dotted line and his agreement was secured, but still there were going to be changes to accommodate the new 007, even though it was said it was like 4 weeks or so into the film before we knew we had him on set to be able to work with. The film was rewritten, although it wasn't a page one rewrite, to take into account the personality and the direction that Dalton wanted to take 007. Because Dalton wanted to make his Bond more serious. In the same way that Roger Moore hadn't copied Sean Connery, he didn't want to copy Roger Moore. He wanted his Bond to be a bit more broken. He wanted him to be a bit more real. He's not the first person to say he wanted his Bond to get back to the Ian Fleming feel. And as John Glenn told the book Some Kind of Hero, he talked about how Dalton had ideas for a look for his James Bond from the very first wardrobe fitting. That as much as there was going to be a bow tie and tuxedo in there, it was Dalton who put forward the idea of having a James Bond in a casual black leather jacket at one point. And duly, that ends up in the film. Now, the fact that Dalton had signed up did mean that The Living Daylights was going to film a bit later than originally planned, that they had to put the start of production back to accommodate Dalton's schedule. Even then, the film would be underway whilst Dalton was completing his filming work on Brenda Starr. But the rest of the cast could now come together, and there were other changes in there. There was a bit of old and new, because the decision was made after a 14-film run to replace Lois Maxwell, for instance, in the role of Miss Moneypenny. It was the Los Angeles Times in the end that reported that Caroline Bliss was going to take on that particular role, but also that we were getting Robert Brown returning as M and Desmond Llewellyn was going to come back as Q. Mariam Darbo, meanwhile, who'd first screen tested for A View to a Kill, she would land her first major screen role, certainly of such profile, in the lead female role in the film. She was announced in August 1986 along with Jerome Crabb and Joe Don Baker, and the ensemble for this was coming together with the view of starting filming at the end of September 1986. So this is quite a contracted story. The bit that we've gone through so far has taken less than 9 months to get from start to finish, and if you consider the current 5-6 year gaps we're seeing between James Bond films, I mean, that's quite an acceleration. So 29th of September was officially marked as the start of photography, with Variety at the time reporting a budget of $32 million and a 19-week shoot for the film. Although by the time photography officially started, it had actually been going on for a couple of weeks already in Gibraltar. Filming for this one was going to take place in Gibraltar, Morocco, Austria, Italy, America, and then coming back to James Bond's home of Pinewood Studios in the UK. And Dalton wasn't there when filming began. In fact, he would wrap up filming on Brenda Starr on a Friday. He would fly to the Bond production, and on the Monday he started his tenure as 007. But it did mean, even when he arrived, that John Glenn would have to shoot around him really for the first day or two, because Dalton needed to alter his physique. He needed to get his hair right. He had to get the look of his Bond right. But he was soon deep into action, and Dalton wanted to do as much of this as he could himself. By October, with filming underway, Dalton could also, because there he was present and he got the look, he could be finally presented to the world's press as the new James Bond. Now, it's interesting, at the point of the press launch, I mean, you could see just where Bond was in the mind of the press and in the mind of journalists, because the accusations were that James Bond was irrelevant and had gone paper thin, and just a flavour of the usual accusations that seem to come round in cyclical, in an orderly cyclical way for the James Bond saga from time to time. How many times we had to read articles about how it's irrelevant and how how it can't possibly redefine itself. Unbeknownst to the assembled press, this was very much redefining itself. Dalton and Broccoli were insisting that the new 007 was different, but of course they would say that. But Dalton and Broccoli also knew what they were shooting and just how grittier, really, the new Bond film was going to be. Now, traditionally, Vic Armstrong was one of the people who worked on the stunts on the James Bond movies, but he was double booked on this one. So instead, in stepped John Richardson. And he talks a little bit about shooting the living daylights in his excellent book, Making Movie Magic. And so he talks about things like how the snow scenes were filmed on an ice lake. There's a bit where the Aston Martin car in the movie, well, let's just say it has a moment with the ice. And so Richardson explains that we actually had to drive across the lake each morning to where we were filming. And he says, I can still hear the noise of the ice cracking as we moved over it. In fact, he says one evening, one of the safety guys was clearing some fresh snowfall off the ice with a bulldozer, and the bulldozer dropped straight through it, albeit in a shallow area. But the safety person concerned did admit that the water was somewhat on the cold side. And so they earned quite a lot of column inches out of the fact that they were bringing Aston Martin back as James Bond vehicle. And Richardson confirms in the book that even though it was a bit of a big secret as far as the press were concerned, he and his teams had been building all the gadgets and jokes based around the car for some time. It had all been storyboarded before he could even get his hands on one of them. There was also a particularly taxing stunt, well, it certainly looked it in the film, that involves a bridge going across a huge ravine. And this is where the ingenuity of the Bond visual and special effects team came in, because this was an era, really, where they're relying far more on models and physicality for things like this. And as Richardson says, I devised a foreground miniature and we set it up in the riverbed away from the action. And he said once it was lined up, it fit perfectly with the bridge, the handrail, and everything above it was real, but below the handrail was the model, and it gave the impression the bridge was actually 20 feet high. And he says if you look, the river in the film that the bridge is going over is actually just a piece of painted cling film. Ingenious. So filming finally wrapped up on the movie on the 13th of February 1987. So it had gone for several months and it had been a taxing, grueling shoot that had travelled the world. But here it was in the can. And so now came the big pressure of how do you get audiences back interested in James Bond? How can they start to sell and present this as something different to the movie that had seen declining fortunes to the franchise just before? Well, first of all, they went looking for music. There's a strong rumour that the Pet Shop Boys for a while were rumoured to be doing the title track to the song. But in fact, it was the band a-ha, particularly popular at the time, who landed the job of recording the title track, The Living Daylights. But this opened up an interesting conflict behind the scenes with the then regular James Bond composer, John Barry. This would be his last film. And so quite recently we've had a film about a-ha the movie, it's cunningly called, and they talk about this, about the moment where they were brought into the world of James Bond. And I think it's no secret whatsoever that a-ha and John Barry did not see eye to eye at all, to the point where there was a sizable fallout between the two parties. And the only thing really the a-ha band members talk about in the documentary before they decide to quickly move it on is perhaps they were a little bit full of themselves at that point and a little bit cocky. Conversely, it didn't sound like Barry particularly enjoyed these people coming in and doing things their way either. And as I said, he would back away from James Bond duties going forward. There were also tonal changes in the film that took place in post-production. And so John Richardson talks about them shooting one particular sequence in North Africa. And he describes it as John Glenn had an idea of a little gag with a flying carpet. Richardson, not unwisely, says it was not one of his better ideas and an absolute bugger to make look good, as we essentially had Bond running across rooftops in Tangier and then jumping onto a rigid carpet which was spread across two cables at a 30-degree angle. Now, this sequence was cut out of the film. In fact, there's quite a lot that was cut out in post-production of The Living Daylights, but this was infamously known as the magic carpet scene, given how it appeared on screen when it was all put together. And one of the reasons it was cut was, first of all, it just didn't seem to work, but also it went against the tone of what they were looking for with the new James Bond film. This was more serious. It was going to be less tongue-in-cheek along those lines, and so moments like that really weren't going to fit. Now, they were hit with a further problem in post-production on this one, where a pirated video version of the film leaked early. Now, this was incredibly rare in 1987. That we're in an era now where films leak online quite a lot. And we've seen a couple of examples, I've covered them in this podcast, of films that have leaked ahead of their release as well. It was pretty much unthinkable in 1987, but a post-production house that was lax with security was identified as to blame in the end. But there was an incomplete version of The Living Daylights that was doing the rounds on the pirate video circuit. Still, the official version was ready for the summer of 1987. So this was about 18 months after work had begun in earnest on writing the film. The Living Daylights was complete. The post-production on the movie was down to, about 4 months, which is roughly what they have on them now as well. And, a big, huge charity premiere, one in Leicester Square in London that Timothy Dalton was nearly not let into as well. And MGM United Artists that was distributing The Living Daylights was just hugely optimistic about this. It felt it had a new Bond, it had a new tone, it had a new story to sell. And so it struck up reported 250 prints for a nationwide release in the UK. It came out in the UK first. And again, it's one of those things that we're quite used to now, a huge amount of prints and blanket bombing, lots of cinemas to get your film out there. Less so in 1987. And so it was a real statement of intent that they were willing to do so here. And out the film went into cinemas. In fact, out it went before reviewers, and the response was, it was quite good, really. That there was a lot of praise for Timothy Dalton and his work in the film. That the movie itself, a little bit up and down, really, but it was clear who the star attraction was. That Dalton was the focus of most of the writing on it. The villains certainly weren't. The running time was brought in for some criticism too, and also a kind of feeling it was still Bond as much as they tried to redefine it. The hope was, though, that commercially the film would surpass what the critics were saying about it, and it did. Okay. Its opening was certainly strong. There was a lot of curiosity for a new James Bond. And if we go to the US release, which is July the 31st, that opening weekend, it opened in first place in America, $11 million opening weekend. Not shabby at that point, certainly by 1987 standards. It knocked RoboCop off the top of the charts, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from Disney as well. Opening the same week as The Living Daylights was a film, you might have heard of this one, it's called The Lost Boys. Remember that? That opened with $5.2 million in second place. Also in the top 10 in the States. The competition included the likes of La Bamba that was doing okay. RoboCop I've mentioned. Summer School from Paramount. Superman 4, The Quest for Peace was not having a good time at all. Full Metal Jacket from Stanley Kubrick was doing okay. Dragnet was doing well as well. Adventures in Babysitting rounded out the top 10 with Beverly Hills Cop 2 just bubbling a little below. However, it was the long term of The Living Daylights' box office that was causing some degree of problem. That as much as, the film was reported in the end to come in with about $40 million to make. The box office globally, including the US release, $191 million. And whilst that was an upgrade on the $152 million that A View to a Kill had brought in at the global box office, if you go back to, say, one of Roger Moore's earlier films, For Your Eyes Only, that was at the $195 million mark, and that was, several years earlier when $191 million was worth more money at that point. Now, over time, the reputation of The Living Daylights has grown, and I think it's fair to say it's far more regarded now than it was at the time of release. And also, there was enough in there. There was enough upward trajectory for Albert R. Broccoli and his team to get moving again with a 2-year gap on the next James Bond movie, 1989's Licence to Kill. Now, I've covered that before in a previous episode of the Film Stories podcast, a film I'm hugely fond of as well. But it's worth noting, in the midst of it all, that I've covered a few James Bond stories in the past when doing film stories. To attempt to redefine such a long-running franchise, to recast it, to represent it, to resell it in basically a little over 18 months flat, that's quite a piece of work, really. Wherever you stand on the living daylights, it is one of the fastest film stories I've covered, and certainly one of the fastest Bonds. And if you don't agree, I'll set Timothy Dalton on you. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. I'm just going to do a couple of parish notices, which is a really polite way of saying terrible plugs. So let's go with them. There are 3 ways you can support this podcast if you happen to like this podcast. The first is if you want to support us financially in what we're doing. I'm on patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you back us there, then you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You find out bits of gossip and bits and bobs on what we're up to as well. You can also support this podcast by subscribing to it at your podcast repository of choice. That costs you nothing. Likewise, leaving an ideally hugely positive review costs you nothing. I do bang on about this every week, but it does make a difference for podcasts without major multinational conglomerates behind them, and it is hugely appreciated. I also publish Film Stories print magazines. Really proud of these. Finishing off issue 35 of Film Stories magazine at the moment, which will be going on sale shortly. We've got issue 10 of Film Junior magazine as well. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can find all of our print magazines. You can find our Sneakers Blu-ray, which we've made here in the UK with a bunch of new extras as well. All for sale at store.filmstories.co.uk. And I think I'll just crack on with the second of the 2 films I'm talking about now, because what I'm doing, not unlike Bond, I'm doing a bit of a tonal shift, and I'm going to move forward a couple of decades. I'm going to move forward to a hit rom-com of the 2010s. How many of those were there? Answer, not many. Let me play you a clip from the second of these films, and then I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Right, we've been dating for over a year now, and I think it's about time people met my beautiful girlfriend. What about us taking an adventure east?
Like Queens?
Singapore, Colin's wedding. Don't you want to meet my family?
I hardly know anything about them. Every time I bring them up, Nick changes the subject. Maybe his parents are poor and he has to send them money.
We'll take a bags and get you checked into first class.
Nick, we can't afford this. So your family is rich?
We're comfortable.
That is exactly what a super rich person would say.
I want money.
1.2 million.
The Nick you're dating is Nick Young?
Yeah, you guys know them or something?
Hells yeah. They're just the biggest developers in all of Singapore.
Damn, Rachel. It's like the Asian Bachelor. These people aren't just rich. They're crazy rich.
Oh, you really should have told me that you're like the Prince William of Asia.
That's ridiculous. Much more of a Harry.
Never let it be said I can't edit these clips with a very uncomfortable end to them. That is a clip from the trailer from 2018's Crazy Rich Asians, directed by John M. Chu, screenplay by Peter Chiarelli and Adele Lim, based on the book Crazy Rich Asians by Kevin Kwan, and starring Constance Wu, Henry Golding, Gemma Chan, Lisa Liu, Awkwafina, Ken Jeong, and Michelle Yeoh. So the story of Crazy Rich Asians, well, let's go back to April 2013, because at that stage, Hollywood development executives, always on the lookout for a new hit book, were buzzing about the possibility of this particular text from author Ken Kwan. He'd penned a romantic comedy. It was called Crazy Rich Asians. And even though it wasn't on bookstores at this stage, there was a race behind the scenes at Hollywood to secure a screen option on the story. So there are 2 bidding wars that take place during the life of this movie, and this was about to be the first, because Kevin Kwan, the aforementioned author, was quickly fielding a collection of offers from Hollywood studios and producers interested in bringing the book to the screen. One of the people, for instance, who was in the running at this stage was Wendy Deng, the then wife of Rupert Murdoch. And according to Vulture, she was actually the first one to approach Kevin Kwan for the book. She put forward a development deal, but in the end, Kwan, well, circumstances worked against him working with her because, as he would tell the Hollywood Reporter, she had a vision for the movie that completely gelled with what I saw, but the deal didn't pan out, partly because of timing, because Wendy Deng at this point was in the midst of her very, very high-profile divorce from Rupert Murdoch. And so also the company that was representing the book, UTA, well, there was no shortage of interest in other competitors, and there were slightly more straightforward offers on the table. That doesn't mean that every offer that Kwan was fielding was palatable. I mean, special mention to the unnamed producer that he told Vulture about, who, quote, felt would make the project more broadly commercial if he considered changing the book's protagonist, Rachel Chu, from a Chinese-American character to a white character. As Kwan said, someone actually said that to one of my representatives, adding the question. I was like, do we even have to respond? It was an intense bidding process that at one stage, he met 6 producers in one day, each vying for the book. There was understandable interest from Hollywood as well, because contextually in 2013, DVD and Blu-ray money was in constant decline. But in particular, the Chinese box office was a huge target for Hollywood. I mean, this was the era where, the period in time really, where Hollywood would adapt its films specifically to woo the Chinese market. And here was a film that on the surface just looked perfect for it, and as a result pretty much everyone in Hollywood had some interest in Crazy Rich Asians. But in the end, the people that Kevin Kwan trusted came along. They were Nina Jacobson and Brad Simpson. Now, they representing the production company Colour Force, that was their firm, and they'd been making the Hunger Games Catching Fire. Jacobson had certainly when she first read the book and got interested in developing the film version and working with production company Ivanhoe Pictures as well. Between them, they put an offer forward, and Kwan was impressed by them. So much so that he agreed to sell an option to his book, and this was the first book he'd ever sold to Hollywood, for $1, a single dollar. Now, this is usually something that's done by far more experienced authors, certainly not ones making this kind of deal for the first time. And whilst it was built into the deal, he would get more money should it go into development, should it get made, should it turn into a hit. At that stage, it was a gamble. There's no guarantee that, I mean, it's no secret that not every book optioned by Hollywood, not even the majority of them, end up on the screen in the end. But he was impressed by Jacobson and Simpson. He thought that, he'd had far more higher profile offers at that stage, but he felt that they got it, that they'd be interested in it and they'd be able to do a good job. And so they had a plan between them, and it wasn't to instantly take the story out to movie studios and get them to stump up front. They were going to do something a little more old-fashioned and package the whole thing together. So packaging movies, the CAA agency in Hollywood got this down to a fine art in the 80s and 90s, whereby they would put together a script, a director, a cast, turn up at a Hollywood studio, say, here is the price for the whole film, we've done all the work for you. And to get people fully on board with Crazy Rich Asians, and also to keep the tone and to keep the style that Kevin Kwan was after, this seemed like a logical way to do it, that they would find the director, they would get the screenwriters ready, and then they'd put the project out to market. So director-wise, let's deal with director first. John M. Chu had hit off the back of Now You See Me. He'd fairly recently at this stage done his biggest box office success, the not very well liked, but the certainly financially successful G.I. Joe Retaliation. And he was just wrapping up production on Now You See Me 2 when he went in, he took meetings to take the Crazy Rich Asians job, or at least put his take on it. So John M. Chu had been enjoying Hollywood success, and he was now looking to, he was taking meetings in China to try and find something a little bit different, and culturally something a little bit different as well. But it was his sister who put the book Crazy Rich Asians on his radar, and he called his agent and said, I'm interested in this book. On the day, here's a Hollywood story for you, the agent had just received the script. I'm coming to the script shortly. So Chu then put together a presentation to the producers, and he really pitched hard for the job. That he pulled in old photos of his parents. They were described as immigrant restaurateurs who bought him filmmaking books in high school. He put in pictures of his 4 older siblings who personally catered his first short film screening. And then also on his pitch, he segued to, quote, a multimedia vision board for a way we haven't seen Asians before. He was putting together casting suggestions, names he was putting forward to Constance Wu, Gemma Chan, Robbie Cheng, and they were impressed. He really wanted the job. The producers decided they really wanted him. Kevin Kwan signed off on his appointment as well, and so there was a director in place. There was also already by this stage a script in place as well, because what Nina Jacobson and Brad Simpson did was they hired a couple of screenwriters who they knew could get this to the starting line. So Peter Chiarelli he knew the genre because he'd enjoyed success in it with the Sandra Bullock headline film The Proposal, and he came in to write the script along with Adele Lim as his co-writer. Chiarelli was the more experienced of the two. I'm coming to that later. But the pair worked firmly in tandem, and they worked independently for the most part. They would send their respective parts of the screenplay backwards and forwards as they fashioned this into a film. And so it got to a point, and we're a couple of years down the track now, where the package was in place. There was a director, there was a script, there were ideas of casting. The question was now, who wanted to stump up to make the film? Well, lots of studios for a start. And in fact, the package that Nina Jacobson and Brad Simpson put out to market was interesting, not just the traditional studios, but also the then fast-rising Netflix, which at this point, it was already clear that it had a checkbook that could outspend everyone else in the business at that stage. It's only really, I'm recording this in the summer of 2022, it's only really that business model started to falter. At this point, Netflix was the place to go if you wanted it, basically, if you wanted to be rich and pretty much guarantee it would be made. And so the bidding war narrowed down to 2 parties. That they chose the studio that was offering the best deal, which was Warner Brothers in this case. This was the highest bidding traditional studio, which also as part of its approach had guaranteed what Netflix couldn't, namely a theatrical distribution of the film. But Netflix, it was outspending Warner Brothers and then some. It wasn't just as part of its pitch willing to greenlight one film, it wanted a trilogy, because Kevin Kwan by this time had published the second book and nearly done the third. And so it was going to guarantee you will get 3 films out of this. Netflix infamously, when it burst onto the television scene with the House of Cards TV show, managed to basically outflummox the entire market by committing to 2 seasons up front, where most people were looking for a pilot or just testing a few episodes. And it was applying the same, really, to its movie bidding. We will do all 3. What's more, all of the parties involved, the producers, the director, Kevin Kwan, would up front receive a 7-figure sum, and Warner Brothers certainly wasn't offering that. They would be rich. So over to a Hollywood Reporter piece from October 2016, where it talked about this whole decision boiled down to a conference call that took place that month. And it was Nina Jacobson who broke the impasse. They couldn't decide which to go with. And she said, we as the producers will go with what the author and the director want. This was firmly over to Kevin Kwan and John M. Chu. And they'd already, as the Hollywood Reporter stated, tried to rationalise the cash grab. As Chu recalled, he said, maybe we donate a percentage of our extra income to great causes. But then they were like, well, where does the money go? And they rationalised it goes right back to trying to get to this position of getting us Asians on the big screen. And they knew how important that was and what a rare opportunity was in front of them at the point Hollywood was at this stage. They were going to have to turn down this 7-figure payday to make that jump. If they'd have taken those checks, none of them would have to work again. But they did turn Netflix down, immediately emotional at what they'd done. But also they knew the importance of this. As much as Hollywood was moving towards slightly more diversity at this stage, it still had some way to go. And it wasn't lost on them that the story doing the rounds, it's not entirely true, but it was still not far off, was that 1993's movie The Joy Luck Club, not a massive box office success, although a critical one, was said to be the last and only time time a Hollywood movie had featured an Asian American cast exclusively at that stage, and they had the opportunity to do just that with a studio backing. So they weren't taking a complete plunge into the unknown. They were backed by the hope that the novel's million copy sales would pave the way to cinema success. But also, it was a risk all round, really, because it was reported in October 2016 by Variety that Warner Brothers had prevailed in the bidding war, that Netflix had been turned down. And it was bigged up that this was going to have a Hollywood movie with an exclusively Asian cast. But the side of this that was riskier than it would have been even 5 years earlier was that romantic comedies themselves had by this stage stopped being a ticket to box office gold. And this was firmly in the romantic comedy genre, as Brad Simpson told Variety. At a time where we keep asking how we can compete with TV and other offerings, it's important to give people something different. And he argued we're taking them to a world that hasn't been shown much on screen, but also he was taking them back to a genre that just hadn't been firing on box office cylinders for some time. Now, Hollywood was, it should be acknowledged, trying to do something about its clear diversity problem at this stage, not least because it was aiming for a global audience more than ever now with its biggest movies, but it was still primarily doing so with casts and stories that, let's just say, weren't necessarily global in nature. And as Nina Jacobson put it, I mean, it just was not much sense from a business point of view. As she said, inclusion is good business. Inclusion is a way of reaching new and broader audiences and keeping material fresh. And so they had their North Star. They knew which way they were going. Warner Brothers was finally on board, was footing the bill, although paying less than Netflix. And the plan was to shoot as early as spring 2017 at this stage, 6 months after all these deals had been signed. Now, Ken Kwan was finishing up the third book in his trilogy of stories. A $40 million production budget, $40 million production budget was allocated to Crazy Rich Asians. And so then it was over to casting. They were finally at this point. And let's go back to John M. Chu's dream casting sheet, which turned out to be pretty close to the mark, because Constance Wu would star in the movie, although she was nearly lost to it because of a scheduling conflict she had with the TV show at the time, Fresh Off the Boat. And she knew that she was on the verge of losing this role, and she wrote John M. Chu a letter explaining that if that was to be and she had to drop out, fair enough, but she really, really wanted it. Unbeknownst to her when she wrote that letter, Chu really, really wanted her as one of the leads in the film as well, to the point where the production on the movie would be delayed by some 5 months to accommodate her television schedule. Michelle Yeoh came aboard, but it turned out that she'd actually dabbled with optioning the book herself. Now, she was approached to play Eleanor, the mother in the film, but she was insistent that this character couldn't be a stereotypical protective, dragon-like mother figure. For her to sign on the dotted line and bring the film some gravitas, she wanted changes, and as it would happen, the third act of the film was altered to accommodate her, to take this character away from this two-dimensional dragon into someone far more understanding and three-dimensional. The trickiest role to cast, though, was the male lead. And this was, they went through the usual motions of this to try and find the character of Nick Young. They went through agents' lists. They went through all the agencies in Hollywood. They found possible candidates as well. In fact, the choice was narrowed down to 4 at one stage, who were all due to read opposite Constance Wu in Los Angeles. Warner Brothers was pressing John M. Chu for his choice. John M. Chu wasn't happy with the selection of who he had. And then something left field happened, because he saw and became aware of the work of Henry Golding. Now, Henry Golding was not an actor at this stage. He was a presenter of travel shows for the BBC and for Discovery Channel Asia. But he saw him, and he saw something in him. And the first that Henry Golding knew that John M. Chu might be interested was he got followed on Instagram by the director. Then, a few days later, Chu got directly in touch and asked Golding to send in a tape. Now, he'd never appeared in a film before, but he would cut short his honeymoon to go for a screen test, and they would take the leap. They would cast him in this major lead role in a major Hollywood romantic comedy, and they really took a gamble to do so. And with everything in place, the film finally had the green light to go. And in fact, filming in the end would start at the end of April 2017, and it would be a very human-heavy movie as well. I mean, just look at the cast, 76 speaking parts in all in this one. And for the scale and the size of the film they were doing, the budget was actually relatively frugal. It meant shooting in Thailand, for instance, was going to be tricky, and the bulk of the shoot would take place in more economical climes. So Malaysia took precedence, and then they did a bit of filming in Singapore as well. But it was still, Malaysia was the far more affordable place to base most of the shooting. There were some things done to try and offset the cost of the movie. I mean, Singapore Airlines was, for instance, invited to participate in exchange for product placement and putting a few quid into the pot, but the airline declined because, according to Brad Simpson, they were not sure the movie would represent the airline and their customers in a good light. Hence, they had to invent a fictional airline for the movie. One of the people who got a real breakthrough in this movie, in this film, was Awkwafina, and she was given the flexibility to improvise a lot of her lines on set, and boy did she take it. And she reflected to the Hollywood Reporter about what it was like being on a film with the cast she was surrounded with this time, and she just said, "We've all been that Asian on set at one point." She said that dynamic didn't exist here. The cast as well, the cast and the crew knew how special it was, and it was reported that everyone was on the lookout for just potential blind spots and cultural cliches. So Constance Wu convinced John M. Chu to remove dialogue from the book at one point about where Rachel boasts about never dating Asian men, for instance. Yo would go around Eleanor's kitchen table set pointing fingers at things that she just didn't think were there. It was important to get the details right, and they knew that when this went out before audiences, this had to be on the money. Still, the cast were bonding as well. I mean, they were going out most nights to eat together, and I say this with a shudder, there was apparently no shortage of karaoke evenings either. I'm not going to sing. Filming wrapped up though, 24th of June 2017, and that gave Chu, a year really to find his film in post-production, but he had a firm idea of what it was anyway. And also, Warner Brothers was really going to push hard to promote this movie. It knew it had something that could potentially break out, and it knew it had something that it needed to nurture and take care with to make that happen. And so the release date was earmarked in the end for August the 15th, 2018 in the US, with a premiere taking place a week or so before that. However, even by the time of the premiere, lots of people had seen the film, because 4 months ahead of that, so we're going to April of 2018, Warner Brothers held what was called a Tastemakers screening in Los Angeles. It brought 12,000 people together, most people from Asian American origin, and played them the film to get a flavour. Is this working? How is this going down? And as the report of that screening goes, audible sniffles were heard throughout the darkened theatre as the romantic comedy played out on screen. But even as the film approached its release date, there was a weight on its shoulders. They felt the responsibility of it. Would Hollywood go back to the same old if this didn't work? I mean, this could be a real pathfinding film and kick open doors for an awful lot of people. And a predicted 20 million opening weekend was coming forth in the trade press, which was okay, but was it enough really? And then the reviews came in, and the reviews were very, very much on its side as well. That as much as it's a scarcity to get very good reviews for a rom-com, the cast, the visual style of it, just the feeling it was something just a little bit different, really cut through. And so while there was the usual sniffiness towards romantic comedies, the reviews were generally on the positive side, in some cases on the ecstatic side. And when the film opened in cinemas for its opening weekend, I mean, it opened on the Wednesday before, on the 15th. The weekend was the 17th and 19th of August 2018. It banked $26 million in that opening weekend, ahead of expectations. It had already grossed $9 million just in the 2 days before. It was the number one movie in America. It knocked The Meg off the top spot. It was up against a new opener, Mark Wahlberg, in the action movie Mile 22. That didn't do great shakes. That was in third place with 13 million. The other big opener was Alpha, which opened with, 10 million, just a more modest opening weekend there. Crazy Rich Asians was the number one movie in America, courtesy of a very, very well-curated marketing campaign and a build-up to it and really strong word of mouth that, crucially, its second weekend drop-off was 6%, 6.4%, tiny number in Hollywood box office scale, that usually we expect films, big films certainly, to drop off 40, 50%, 60, 70 in some cases in their second weekend. Crazy Rich Asians held its audience. The Meg was in second place again, and the Happy Time Murders opened the week after as well. So there wasn't like a lot of competition, but when the film held top spot 3 weeks running, dropping only 11% of its money the third week, well, it was a hit. It crossed $100 million in under 3 weeks at the US box office. It had been a while at that stage since a rom-com had certainly done that. It was knocked off in the end by The Nun, which opened to 53 million in September 2018. But by the time Crazy Rich Asians left US cinemas, it had 174 million in the bank, added another 64 million overseas for a worldwide gross just shy of $240 million, comfortably enough to trigger the sequel, not least when the DVD, when the streaming, when all the other ancillary money started to be counted. Which means it's a shame this one doesn't quite have the happy ending it deserves, because the problem since has been that sequel, that Warner Brothers was keen to press ahead with the next two films after the first one hit, but commitments from the cast meant they couldn't get together until 2020 at the earliest. Then, of course, something happened to the world in 2020, so that slowed things down. But even by that stage, there was just a sour taste around Crazy Rich Asians 2, because Adele Lim, the co-writer of the first film, had walked away by 2020 because she learned she'd been offered $110 million for writing the second movie. Not massively shabby, but then she found out her co-writer, Peter Schiarelli, had been offered the best part of $1 million, 8-9 times as much as her. And it was a pay dispute that Warner Brothers argued was based on experience. Remember, I mentioned that before. He was a far more experienced writer. But conversely, the pair of them had written the first film. It had gone on to great guns for a whole bunch of reasons. The pay dispute was not resolved. Adele Lim just walked away. And in the end, Peter Schiarelli would also walk away as well. I mean, there's no question that the blame was being put on him for this. And Crazy Rich Asians 2 is still, at the time of recording this, active. It's just Amy Wang has now come in to write the screenplay for it. Her salary hasn't been revealed. And then there's a spin-off movie that's also looking like it's a little bit further down the track, based around the character played by Gemma Chan in the film. Jason Kim is writing that. And so it's just a shame that the plans just went off track, really, because at one stage they were so confident Crazy Rich Asians 2 and 3 were going to be made back-to-back, and it just seems that they stumbled over something so silly, because the sequels could be before the camera. We could have more of these now. You have to imagine Netflix just wouldn't have messed around, and Warner Brothers has fumbled the follow-ups after just sublimely handling the original. But the original is still out there. It's still hugely popular. It's still a success. And it is proof that no matter how dormant a genre is, you can do things with it. And it's also proof that as much as people sneer about diversity and try to find stories with different characters from different backgrounds, put these stories on the big screen, put these creatives on the big screen, put these performers on the big screen. And what do you know? If you built it, we might just come along. And that's certainly what happened with Crazy Rich Asians. I think it's a whole lot of fun, and I really wish we'd had more sequels, and it had kicked open a few more doors that at the time of recording it just hasn't really done so enough yet. Not for the fault of the film, but hopefully the long tail of this will ensure that those doors eventually are opened up just a little bit wider. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. It's actually the last episode of Film Stories before our summer break. There'll be one special that's going to drop while I'm away. But in terms of your regular weekly Film Stories, that's going to be it for a few weeks now, because I'm just putting my feet up and watching a whole lot more films. I'll still be active on Twitter. Well, possibly in that time. I'm on Twitter at Simon Brew. The entire Film Stories project is on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. Our website is going to be busy and updated, filmstories.co.uk. If you want to support our print magazines as well, I'm just, as soon as I finish recording this, signing off issue 35 of the magazine. That's at store.filmstories.co.uk. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. Most important thing, as always, though, is that you all take care of yourselves, and thank you so much for your support. Thank you for listening. I'll be back in a few weeks. Until then, you all look after yourselves. Take care. Bye-bye.